So if you remember last week, we talked about the transmission of the Bible, its reliability as far as can we know that what they wrote then is what we have now. And I mentioned that I downloaded this 17-hour class by Dan Wallace and went through it to prepare for that class. And even in that 17-hour class, Dan Wallace says, this is not even the tip of the iceberg. This is the tip of the iceberg. So I think what we talked about last week, that's like the snowflake on top of the tip of the iceberg. Now, I was thinking about that, and it's kind of frustrating to think, there's so much information out there. You could study one topic and spend your whole life doing that, and you still wouldn't know everything about that topic. But obviously, that's why we learn things in a certain way. You don't start with the details. You start with the main points, the main takeaways. And so if you remember from last week, the Bible is the most copied book of all time. The New Testament is the most copied book of all time. There are more copies of the New Testament than many ancient works combined. Every time we find a new copy, there are errors in that copy, because every time you copy a book by hand, you will make a mistake. So the reason there's so many errors, 400,000 to 500,000, is because we have so many copies. And Dan Wallace said, if you really knew how hard it was to copy a book by hand, you would be shocked that it's that few. Even though there are thousands of variants, we can still get back to the original through textual criticism. We have so much material that we can cross-reference things, we can look up things, compare manuscripts. And of those hundreds of thousands of variants, 99.75 either affect very little or nothing, aren't even translatable. The minority, 0.25, are ones that are difficult, that change the meaning, and that it's difficult to tell whether or not it's original. Everybody remembers this. And if you think about it, if you were going to be consistent, and you were going to say that we can't know what was in the Bible, you would have to say that we can't know anything about ancient history, because the Bible is so much stronger. It's light years away from all of the ancient history we have. Now, I meant to leave you with something last week, and it went so long that I kind of forgot to put that in there. But you could have a perfectly transmitted document that's still full of lies. So tonight we're going to talk about a different kind of reliability. It's just, is the Bible trustworthy? So in other words, how do we know that the biblical writers told the truth? A couple of questions we're going to answer tonight. Is there eyewitness testimony in the Gospels and Acts? And how do we know that the authors told the truth? The reason we use the Gospels and Acts, you can get certain facts, certain eyewitness details from the epistles, but the epistles are just letters. You're basically reading someone's mail. Whereas the Gospels and Acts, it's like these people with these names went to this place, they did this, they talked to these people said these words. You can see a lot of eyewitness details in the Gospels and Acts, so that's why we're focusing on these. So if you have your book, open to page 225. A lot of times people don't stop and think that, how do you know that someone was actually observing a certain event? And that's where eyewitness testimony comes into play. And some people are like, well, how do you know that a fact or some testimony is eyewitness? So if you look there on page 255, there's a section that says, were they really eyewitnesses? Eyewitness evidence Luke. And if you turn the page, you will see that there's a list of 84 eyewitness details that have been proven using methods outside the Bible. So, yes, a long list. So you can actually look into these things and see, was that really how it happened? And instead of going through the entire list of 84 things, I will probably go through 4. Now, Luke is nice for this because Luke's a doctor, he's a historian, he's very detailed, almost like obsessively detailed. So some of these that I think are really interesting, if you look at number 6, Paul and, I believe it's Barnabas, they go into Lycaonium, and they heal a man. And the people there think that they are gods. And they start to worship them. And in Acts, it says that they thought that they were Zeus and Hermes. They thought Barnabas was Zeus, and that Paul was Hermes. Now, if you look at that mythology, Zeus was a head god, Hermes was his messenger. Now, that seems kind of strange because Paul is the head missionary of this group, but the reason they thought he was Hermes was because he was the one doing the most talking. And so, in this part of the Roman Empire, these gods were revered more than in other parts. And the way they describe these gods and apply them to Paul and Barnabas, it just fits. Fits the culture, fits the context. Another interesting one is number 22. This is a sermon that Paul gives in Acts 17. They're in Athens. And these people call Paul a babbler. That is a slang word that was not used in every single place in Greece, but we know it was used in Athens. So isn't it interesting, this story that takes place in this certain city, this word comes up that we know was used in that city, but not necessarily in other cities in the surrounding area. It's kind of interesting. 46, I'll just read this one. It just says, the appropriate route passing across the open sea south of Cyprus, favored by persistent northwest winds. They're on a ship. They want to get from point A to point B. The wind is a certain direction, and they take a certain route. And you can go there today and you can say, yes, if I were on an ancient boat, this would make the most sense to get to this destination. And finally, 76, they're on a boat in Acts 27, and they throw down these little measuring instruments to take soundings of how deep the water is. The word for taking soundings is a technical term that you wouldn't know unless you had a shipping background. And Luke gets that word right. And you can actually go, we don't know exactly where they are, but we know that they're off the coast of Malta. And you can actually go to Malta today and measure the depth of the water, and it's comparable to the depth that Luke records. It'd be very difficult to make up these details, right? Now, if you go forward a couple pages to page 263, you will see the same thing for the Gospel of John. And this list consists of 59 things. And these are things that have been corroborated outside the Bible. This is not just some story from a land far, far away. We know where these places are. There are certain streets that are mentioned in the Bible that we think we know, like where those streets are today. It actually happened. And these details are things that you would not be able to know if you weren't there. So some other things. If you are looking for eyewitness testimony, you need to know, do the people that are making these claims, do they know the lay of the land? And I'll just give you a couple of examples. We all know that Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore tree. I'm pretty sure that this is a sycamore tree. According to the internet, this is exactly the tree that you would want to show for this. But I'm not really schooled in like biblical botany or anything like that. But I think that this is correct. But even if this is not the actual tree, the commentaries say that a sycamore tree, it's not the same sycamore tree we have in America, but those kinds of trees tend to have low branches. And so it's not that he had to like climb up 100 feet to see Jesus. He could have just stepped up, walked around on these low branches. John mentions the pool of Bethesda. The cool thing about this is, in the past, people had said, this seems legendary. It says that this pool is beside the sheep gate, and it says it has 5 covered colonnades. And people said, how could you have 5 colored colonnades? Is this like a pentagon shape? It doesn't make any sense. We don't know of any pool in this area. Now, just because you don't know of something, just because you can't find something to back up the Bible, that doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And sure enough, at some point, somebody found a pool close to the sheep gate. We think it's the pool of Bethesda. And it tells us that the 5th colonnade actually went through the middle. So it was kind of like 2 pools divided by this 5th colonnade. And that fits with John's description. It wasn't a pentagon shape. It was more like the number 8.
So the pool is inside the walls there?
Yes. That's the idea.
That was actually found in like fairly recent history.
Yeah. I don't know exactly when it was
60s
found.
or something.
Yeah. Now, some people, there's always going to be disagreement. Like, is this the actual pool of Bethesda? Seems like it is. But even if it's not, it proves that these pools had five colonnades like John describes. Now, obviously, there are many other things that we could study, but this is just kind of those lay of the land eyewitness details. There's also something that's like this, but it's on steroids. This is what's known as undesigned coincidences. It's also known as interlocking, but I think interlocking is used less. I actually like the name interlocking better. But it's basically how the different gospel accounts answer each other's questions in the same story. There are certain details given in the gospels, because the gospels all record the same events. They're not totally the same, but especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very similar. So the same story is told multiple times. And in some Gospels, there will be these details that are included that they don't really explain anything, but they're just there. But then when you compare them to the other Gospels, the details in those Gospels that don't mean anything, when you put them together, you see a fuller picture. This has actually been around since the 1800s, and it's just kind of being revived. There is a guy in the resources named Tim McGrew, and he's really into this kind of thing. So I'll give you the best example of interlocking, and it is the only miracle other than the resurrection that appears in all four Gospels, which is the feeding of the 5,000. Now, I'm not going to use Matthew because Matthew is so similar to Mark and Luke, so we can get away with three Gospels here. But in Mark 6, we read about the feeding of the 5,000, and Mark tells us that many people were coming and going. But he doesn't tell us why many people were coming and going, he just states the fact. When you read about this miracle in John 6, John doesn't tell you that it was really crowded, but he tells you that the Passover was near. And you know how the Jews are when it comes to Passover. There would have been crowds in the area. So this detail in John explains something in Mark. That's interlocking. But then later in John's account, when Jesus asks, where are we going to buy bread for these people, he turns to Philip. Now, Philip is not a major character in the story, like in the Gospels. You would think that if Jesus was going to ask someone where to buy bread, he would probably talk to Judas because he had the money, or Peter because he's kind of the leader. So why does he turn to Philip? And then Andrew gets involved. Again, not the most prominent character. We read in Luke 9 that this miracle took place in Bethsaida. Now, why does that have anything to do with anything? If you go back to John 1, you read that Philip and Andrew's hometown was Bethsaida. So the reason Jesus is turning to Philip is because he's from there. He's saying, you know where to buy bread. Where would we go to feed this many people? So you see there's like this back and forth here. Things in John are explained by things in Luke. Things in Mark are explained by things in John. Luke also mentions that Jesus had them sit down on the green grass. Just a throwaway detail. Grass is usually green, right? John also mentions that the loaves that Jesus multiplied were made of barley. He multiplied barley loaves and fish. We know from history that the Passover comes after the 5 rainiest months and at the end of the barley harvest. Grass is not always green in Israel, and it makes sense that there would be barley loaves because right after the barley harvest, there's a lot of barley. People are just eating it, trying to get rid of it. So you can see how these things fit together. They explain each other. It's be very difficult to fake something like this. If you remember J. Warner Wallace from previous weeks, he said, "These meaningless details are just what I would expect to hear from eyewitnesses who are simply describing what they saw, including the details that don't really matter in the larger narrative." And remember, J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective, also a Christian. He wrote Cold Case Christianity, which I would recommend if you are interested in this kind of thing. Another way that we know that they were actually eyewitnesses, this is the most cutting edge thing that I know of in apologetics. I think this is less than 35 years old. I don't know of anything that is quite this recent as far as the development of this. But it looks into what were the most popular Jewish names when Jesus was alive. There was a Jewish woman, I believe she was an archaeologist, named Tal Ilan, and she went around and she just started collecting inscriptions or things on graves, sites, bone boxes, anything she could find in a story, and she wrote down all the names that she found. And every time she would find a Simon, she'd add a Simon to the list. Every time she found a Jesus, she'd add a Jesus to the list. Now, another guy took her work. His name's Richard Bauckham. This is his tome on the eyewitness evidence for Jesus. I have not read this whole thing. It's on my to-do list. But he looked at her data, and he said, Talalan includes names that are found in fictional works. Now, that would kind of skew the data, because if you want to know how popular the name Harry is, you don't watch Harry Potter and put a check mark, right? Because Harry Potter's not real, if you didn't know. So he kind of switched it up a little bit, and he got a very similar list. But the number one name was Simon, or a variant of Simon, which would be Simeon, Joseph, Lazarus, or also Eliezer, that's the same name, Judas or Judah, John or Yohanan, and number 6 is Jesus. Now, Jesus' real name was Yeshua, also known as Joshua, but we call him Jesus because that's how it appears in the Greek. Now, what does this have to do with anything? I think I told some people wrong on this. I was under the impression that if you went through the New Testament, you could actually count up all the names and they would fit this list perfectly. But upon further reading, it's not quite that neat. What you do is you take all these names together, or for this first statistic here, the first 2. So if you look outside the New Testament, 15.6% of men bore one of the 2 most popular Jewish names in this place at this time. If you look inside the New Testament, you get a very similar number, 18.2%. If you look outside the New Testament, 41.5% of men bore one of the 9 most popular names. Again, inside the New Testament, very similar statistic, 40.3% of men bore one of the 9 most popular names. 7.9% of men bore a name that is not attested, 7.9% of men bore a name that is attested only once in the sources. In the New Testament, it's 3.9%. And Richard Bauckham points out the percentages for men in the New Testament thus correlates remarkably closely with those for the population in general. It would be very hard to come up with a story and get all of the proper names in there.
Is that for the Jewish men only? Not doesn't include any of the Romans or
No.
Greeks? Okay.
But it includes Jewish men outside the Bible and inside.
Okay.
It's just, this is like such a minute detail that if it was a fictional story, it would be easily overlooked.
Right. Yeah, it'd be really hard to fake.
Yeah.
Because you didn't have Wikipedia back then. You know, I can tell you a very popular name in 1983 was Christopher, because I have that very popular, boring name. But other than that, I mean, I couldn't give you a list of what were the most popular names. I wouldn't be able to craft a story with those names. And actually, some critics of the Bible said that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses, and not only that, but they weren't even written in Israel. They were written in other countries. But the problem with that is you can do the same thing in Egypt, and you get a totally different list for the names, and there's only 2 that are in both lists, Eliezer, or Lazarus, and Joseph. But not only that, even when people in the New Testament talk about someone, they talk about them in a way that you would expect people to talk. There's so many Simons, they didn't have last names. So you need a qualifier to tell people who you're talking about. That's why we have Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Tanner, Simon the Leper, Simon of Cyrene, and Simon who had been practicing magic, also known as Simon the Magician. Same thing with Jesus. When the gospel writers talk about Jesus, they talk about him like you know who he is. So they usually just call him Jesus. But when they quote people who are talking about Jesus, the people talk about Jesus in a way that you would expect people to talk about someone with a very popular name. He's not just Jesus, he's Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Galilean, Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee, Jesus who was crucified, Jesus called Christ. How in the world could you make up a story and put those details in there for us to investigate 2,000 years later? We also know that they told the truth because of what is known as the criterion of embarrassment. This is used in how we do history. We'll talk about this next week a lot. If you are fabricating a story, you don't include details that are embarrassing or that hurt your case, or if you're trying to argue something, you don't include details that would make it harder to convince someone. Okay? So some examples of these. Peter is kind of the leader of the disciples, but Jesus kind of called him Satan. Not something that you would really want a whole lot of people to know. Even worse, when Jesus goes to the cross, Peter denies him 3 times. Why would you include that in there if it didn't happen? Now, you could exclude it, and you could still have a true story. But if you include it, that's even more weight for the fact that you are telling the truth. Over and over and over in the Gospels, the disciples are so dull. They don't understand anything. Jesus is constantly having to explain things to them. There are other people that get it right off the bat, but they're sitting there thinking, can you explain this to us? We don't really get it. Why would you make yourself look foolish? And this is also a biggie. The women and John were the only ones to go with Jesus all the way to the cross, and the women were the first ones to go to the tomb. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, that would not be something that you would make up. It's a common misconception that women couldn't testify in court, but it wasn't that they couldn't testify, it was that their testimony was less than a man's. So you can imagine these guys going around telling this story, and it would have been scandalous just from the get-go, the fact that your Savior had been crucified. The New Testament says that a crucified Savior, that's foolishness to the Jews, stumbling block to Greeks. Sorry, I got that backwards. The cross is foolishness to Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews. It would really hurt your case to invent that. Nobody would invent that in the Greco-Roman world. And then to say that women were the first ones at the tomb, if a woman's testimony isn't as strong as a man's, then a lot of people would just kind of laugh in your face. How can you believe that these women actually saw a man come back from the dead? Also, I think it's very important to note that the disciples died for their faith. We know that they actually believed what they taught because not only did they die for it, but they were willing to die. They were willing to suffer. Now, I must admit, some of the history with the martyrdoms of the disciples is a little sketchy. Like, we don't know exactly how it all went down. There are conflicting reports. You know, along the way, some people are like, well, I want Peter to die in my town, so I'm going to make up a story about him. But not all reports have the same weight. You can sift through those. And there's nothing that says the disciples made a bunch of money off of this gospel, retired by the Mediterranean Sea, and lived out their days in comfort. It just didn't happen. A lot of people think that John did live to old age after he'd been banished to an island, but there are sources that say that John actually did die. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week as well. So now we're going to talk about the other side of the coin. I've given you positive reasons to believe that the Bible writers told the truth, but now we're going to talk about what are known as Bible difficulties. This is kind of like the other side, the kind of negative things that we need to deal with to show that the Bible is reliable. Now, one of the difficult things about Bible difficulties is that they're difficult. Anybody? Okay. It's even difficult to give a good definition of what a difficulty is. There is a video on YouTube. I think it's Ravi Zacharias. He's doing a question and answer time. This guy comes up to the microphone and is like, what about all the contradictions in the Bible? Like, you know, the Bible says I shouldn't have sex with my girlfriend. See? Contradiction. What's up with that? And you're just kind of left scratching your head like, just because you don't like what the Bible has to say, that doesn't mean that that's a contradiction. Not even a good example. So what is a difficulty? There are a few different ways to describe these. Does the Bible record things that are too unbelievable? For example, people living for hundreds of years, a 9-foot-tall man, etc. Another kind of Bible difficulty is when the Bible seems to conflict with something outside itself. So does the Bible conflict with a known fact of science or history? So with that Pool of Bethesda thing, that used to be a conflict of history. How can we believe in the Pool of Bethesda when we haven't found it? And then the big one that we'll talk about tonight, does the Bible conflict with itself? This is like internal contradictions. How do we deal with these? Why should we bother with this? Some people lose faith over this issue. There are people who think that if you can find one thing in the Bible where you can't reconcile it, then you need to chuck the whole Bible. It's not true. There's this weird story in the Old Testament where it describes like a giant bowl, and it gives you the diameter and the circumference. And when you do the math, it doesn't come out to 3.14. It just comes out to 3. Now, those people were probably just estimating or just using round numbers. There is a way to harmonize that other than just estimating. But there are people who think that if they made a mistake on the size of this bowl, then therefore the Bible can't be trusted and you shouldn't be a Christian. Now, even if the Bible is just decently reliable, it would still be enough to give us faith that the God of the Bible is true. But we believe that the Bible is inerrant. Your children will probably come in contact with this in college. I know I did. Professors always trying to undermine the Bible, trying to throw some supposed contradiction out there. We should also try to harmonize these because it can be fun. I went to a Bible study one time where me and a bunch of my roommates, after the Bible study, we just kind of sat around, we tried to stump each other with Bible difficulties. It's like we'd give a Bible difficulty and we'd be like, what are the ways that you could harmonize this? And everybody would try to give their guess, like, how do you harmonize this passage? And if you got it, everyone thought that that was pretty cool. And if you didn't, then everyone made fun of you. But it can be pretty fun. First, it would be nice to know what it means to have an inerrant Bible. What is inerrancy? The Bible does speak a lot about how trustworthy it is. So there is internal testimony. And that's not necessarily arguing in a circle because you want to give a witness time to speak for themselves, in this case, the Bible. But inerrancy is also it's something that we know from logic. And basically it goes, we have a perfect God that doesn't make mistakes. The Bible is God's word. Therefore, the Bible doesn't make mistakes. Now, this has nothing to do with transmission mistakes that we talked about last week. This is like contradictions. Okay? Everybody tracking with me? Now, we don't believe that the Bible makes mistakes, but there are mistakes in the Bible. And I'm not a heretic for saying that. There are actually lies in the Bible. Have you ever stopped to think about that? For example, in Joshua 2, Rahab lies about, she lies to the men of Jericho about whether the spies have stayed in the city or left. Now, the Bible records a lie, but it accurately records that lie. So that's not a mistake in the sense of the Bible making a mistake. Now, you might think that that seems pretty easy, but that does actually trip people up. The Bible could also record someone who was mistaken. For example, Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection, she's sitting there crying at the tomb. Jesus comes up, says something to her. She mistakes him for the gardener. But the fact that she made a mistake doesn't mean the Bible makes a mistake. The Bible is truthful in recording what she did. Kind of a better example of this, there is an apologist who is a Messianic Jew, who's just a Jew that believes in Jesus. And he has a ministry to Jews. And he did this thing on his radio show where he would go through places in the New Testament where the Jews would claim that there was a contradiction. And in Acts 7, Stephen gives a speech. And this rabbi was saying that Stephen got his history wrong in this speech. He had a detail in there that wasn't factually correct. Now, this apologist said, I think that I can actually give you a reason why Stephen was correct. But even if he wasn't, if someone's giving a speech, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything in that speech is going to be absolutely true. It's just that the Bible records what was said. Now, I don't think that Stephen made a mistake. So the Bible is inerrant in all that it affirms. It would also be good to know, what is a contradiction? In logic, there's something known as the law of non-contradiction, which states it is impossible for something to be and not to be at the same time and in the same sense. So to give you a few examples of at the same time, these two sentences, the classroom has no people in it, the classroom has 9 people in it. It's not contradictory if number 1 was said at 5:30 this morning and number 2 was said at 9:30 this morning. Different phrases said at different times about the same place. So you could say, we all love to pick on Daniel. You could say Daniel was a baby Daniel is a full-grown man. Now, those two things were said about Daniel, one when he was a baby and one when he was a full-grown man. Not a contradiction. This one tends to trip people up a little bit more. It's not a contradiction if it's in a different sense. So, for example, you could say the classroom is empty, the classroom is full. Those are opposite statements, but it depends on what it means by empty and full. So imagine someone says, okay, so it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and someone comes to me and says, are there any people in your room? And I say, the classroom is empty. They say, good, because we need 24 chairs. And I say, you should go to my room, it's full. It was empty in terms of people, it's full in terms of chairs. So in the same sense. Now, you could also take into consideration figurative language. So, like, let's use the Daniel example again. You could say Daniel is a baby and Daniel is a full-grown man. Well, if Daniel is holding a baby named Daniel, then both of those phrases are not contradictory because you're talking about two different people. You could also say that even though Daniel is a full-grown man, he acts like a baby. Now that's more figurative language. You're not actually saying that he is a baby. So now let's get into some of these Bible difficulties. You always, you want to look at this little sheet here. This is the sheet with the book text on the front. Look at number 2. You always want to examine the context. In the example on the screen, there is a passage in the Bible that says there is no God. Wow, the Bible teaches atheism. Does anyone know what precedes this phrase?
The fool saith in his heart.
Very good. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, technically, you could say, there is no God is in the Bible, but it's ripping it out of context. Anytime you read a Bible verse, you want to look at its context. Anytime you interpret a Bible verse, you want to look at it in its context. And anytime you see a Bible difficulty, look at it in its context. I've actually seen this on an atheist website as proof that the Bible teaches that the earth is flat. It says, I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Now, why do you think that that would teach a flat earth?
Line of vision as you go around.
Okay? Because this says that it could be seen from the ends of the earth. That is exactly what they said. Now, what they don't tell you is the very first sentence in this verse says, these are the visions I saw while I was lying in my bed. So this is like a dream that someone had. Totally changes the context, don't you think? As far as figurative language, I've also heard people say that the earth is flat according to the Bible because Job 9, 5-6 says that the earth is suspended on pillars. Now look at this. He moves the mountains without their knowing and overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. Now, do mountains know anything? No, a mountain can't know anything. Now, that should be a pretty good indication that this is figurative language. I would also say, since we know that there are no pillars holding the earth up, that is also an indication of figurative language. Now, in that same book, it says that he spreads out the northern skies over empty space and suspends the earth on nothing. This is kind of a disagreement within apologetics and Christianity in general. Do you take something like that and read modern science into it? Because actually the earth is hanging on nothing. And if you remember Hugh Ross takes the view that you can read scientific truths like that. William Lane Craig says you can't. But I think it makes sense. You know, if it aligns with what we know about the natural world, then it's not figurative. And if it doesn't, then it must be figurative. That might seem like special pleading, but that happens in songs all the time. This is a pretty awesome one. And this one's a little tricky. Matthew 20 says, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Luke says that as Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He called out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Now, were they leaving Jericho? Or were they going into Jericho? Were there two blind men, or was there one blind man? Now, the blind man one is pretty easy. Anytime you have two blind men, you also have one blind man. It seems that for some reason Luke just focused on one of them. Maybe he was more vocal, or he just wanted to simplify things. That's not that hard to wrap your head around. If you run into a group of friends at Walmart, and then you tell somebody the story, you might mention the people that they know, but you wouldn't necessarily mention everybody. So what about one says they were leaving Jericho, one says as they approached Jericho. Now you could look at this from the time aspect, from the law of non-contradiction. Jesus was an itinerant preacher, which means he was constantly going from place to place. He was probably giving the same sermons over and over again, just a little bit different. He probably had the same experiences over and over again. There are things like that seem contradictory in the Bible where you can harmonize it by noting that maybe it was two different instances. I don't think it works with this one, but you could say, in a different sense, he was approaching Jericho or leaving Jericho. For example, maybe there were two Jerichos. Now, do you think an atheist would accept that? Like two Jerichos side by side? That seems pretty far out. How do we deal with this? I actually came up with a great harmonization for this passage just by sitting and thinking. For example, our county line has this really strange geographical feature. It goes east to west, and then all of a sudden it turns north and south for a teeny tiny bit, and then it continues going east and west. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, our school is down here, and our town is up here, and there's something very important in our town. The only place to buy gas within 7 miles. And when I was in high school, I had a buddy, Devin, who lived in this vicinity of 245. And so I was thinking, it would be possible to leave school, as we normally would, drive north on 68, get into West Liberty, stop at the gas station, get some gas, turn left, go west on 245 to my friend Devin's house. And you could imagine a situation where I'm sitting at the dinner table and my mom says, "What did you guys do after school today?" And it would be really strange to say it this way, but I could say, well, after leaving Champaign County, we stopped for gas. And my friend Devin could be sitting at the table, and his mom could say, "What did you do after school today?" And he said, "Before entering Champaign County, we stopped for gas." And even though those seem contradictory, they actually are both true statements. I was pretty impressed by that in myself. Until I found out that is actually not how you harmonize the passage. There were two Jerichos side by side. Now that sounded really stupid when I first threw that out there, but what happened was there was an old Jericho and a new Jericho, and there were places where you had to leave one to get to the other. So both gospel writers were telling the truth.
Well, but it could just be two different events also, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think there are things in the text that would argue against that.
Okay.
But if worst came to worst,
Kind of like East Liberty and West Liberty.
yeah. Well, kind of. Aren't there multiple West Liberties in Ohio, though?
Yeah, there's 3.
Yeah, so it could be something like that. Now, I have a Bible difficulty that is a little bit more involved than these. The last time I taught this class, I thought to myself, I want to find a Bible difficulty that's like really over the top, that I don't know how to harmonize, and then I want to work through it and then use it in my presentation. And I found a documentary from the History Channel called Bible Secrets Revealed. Now, the History Channel used to be pretty good. Now everything has the word secret and mystery and lost and stolen and this, that, and the other thing in the title. It's very over the top. But I found an episode called Lost in Translation. I'm going to show you a clip from this. It's very sensational. That's the word I was trying to think of. Just within the first few minutes of this documentary, they cast doubt on the transmission of the Bible, the interpretation of the Bible, the historical reliability of the Bible, and the authorship of the Bible. And in this clip, you will see a number of men, and one of them is named Robert Cargill. This guy, very smart man. He is not a friend of Christianity. He teaches classics and religious studies at the University of Iowa, and he has an awesome beard. I mean, look at that thing, okay? It used to be that you could watch this episode just by plugging in your Apple TV, and interestingly enough, it was one of the few things on the History Channel app thing where you could watch the whole thing. It was just there, it was free, it was back in the good old days. I could not find this thing on YouTube, I could not find it on my Apple TV, I could not find it anywhere, so I had to break down and buy it. I felt kind of bad spending $3 on such heresy. But they are so weird about copyright. I cannot take a screenshot of this, I cannot download it, I cannot record it, I cannot even put it up on the screen. So I have to unplug this so that you can watch it. And that's why I got my little receiver here. So we're going to sit around this like it's 1999, and we have one TV for everybody.
There's a lot in the Bible.
Hold on, we're going to go back. Oh boy, that's not what I wanted.
Single individual.
Okay, not this part. Erase this from your memory.
Understanding what the text is saying. There's a lot in the Bible that tells you that whatever part of God is in there, some human being is in there too. And you also know it by some of the ideas and the way that they develop and evolve, some of the contradictions, some of the same stories told twice.
One Bible tale containing curious contradictions is the story of the young King David
Listen to that voice.
and his deadly battle against the Philistine giant, Goliath.
David gets his slingshot. He throws the rock. It hits Goliath in the head, and it knocks him out and kills him. And if you read 1 Samuel 17, 49 and 50, it says, and he killed him with the stone, and then it specifically says there was no sword in his hand. Goliath is dead without a sword. And if you read the very next verse, it then says, David then took Goliath's sword and cut off his head and killed him. So now you've got Goliath being killed twice. However, in 2 Samuel 21, we have a different name, Elhanan, instead of David, as the one who killed Goliath. So now the question is, who really killed Goliath? Was it David or was it Elhanan?
Curiously, in a later book of the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles, the question of who killed Goliath appears to be answered.
In the account of Elhanan killing Goliath, the Hebrew text is very clear. Elhanan kills Goliath. But in the English translation, it actually says that he kills the brother of Goliath. That way David gets the credit for killing Goliath, and Elhanan gets credit for killing Goliath's brother.
Is this an example of a simple historical mistake? Or might the story of David and Goliath have been deliberately altered to give the future Hebrew King David credit for performing an act of bravery?
We know these books are not historically accurate because they have discrepancies in them and contradictions among themselves.
Bart.
They are at odds with one another. They're clearly told from a particular religious perspective. They're not disinterested history the way we would think of it today.
Bart Ehrman from last week. Recognize him? Okay, hold on. Let me get this fixed up here. Now, there is a part in this that I would like to point out.
The Hebrew text is very clear.
Notice this scene. It says Samuel at the top. This guy's going to start talking, and it will change.
Elhanan kills Goliath. But in the English
Right
translation, it actually says that he kills the brother of Goliath.
That's gonna be important in a second. So, notice, this is what's called the machine gun tactic. They just throw everything out at you. You have no idea. You can't even go get your Bible, let alone open it up, look up the passages, and figure it out. I had to watch this thing and start, stop, go through all the way just to figure out what they were saying once I got my Bible out.
Do it to confuse you.
That could be, yeah. So there are actually 3 difficulties. And I'm just going to quote that Cargill guy. The first one, he says, "It says, and he killed him with the stone. And then it specifically says there was no sword in his hand. Goliath is dead without a sword." Number 2, in the very next verse, it then says, David then took Goliath's sword and cut off his head and killed him. So now you've got Goliath being killed twice. Doesn't sound fun. Number 3, so now the question is, who killed Goliath? Was it David or was it Elhanan? Did Goliath have a sword or not? Was Goliath killed by a sling or a sword? Who killed Goliath, David or Elhanan? We will deal with the first one first. Again, the number 1 rule for Bible difficulties, you always read the passage. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 17. Let's back up for some context. It's up on the screen. You don't really need to turn there.
Machine gun again.
Yes. We'll start with verse 45. But David replied to the Philistine, "You are coming against me with sword and spear and javelin." He says it right there. You have a sword. "But I am coming against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head." I'm going to skip verse 47. Starting again at 48. The Philistine drew steadily closer to David to attack him, while David quickly ran toward the battle line to attack the Philistine. David reached his hand into the bag and took out a stone. He slung it, striking the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank deeply into his forehead, and he fell down with his face to the ground. Verse 50, David prevailed over the Philistine with just a sling and a stone. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. David did not even have a sword in his hand. He ran and stood over the Philistine. He grabbed his sword, his meaning Goliath's, drew it from its sheath, killed him, and cut off his head. So did Goliath have a sword or not? The text says David did not even have a sword in his hand. Why does Cargill say that Goliath does not have a sword? In verse 51, it says he grabbed his sword. Now David has a sword. Where did he get it? If you go back, the very first verse we read said, "You are coming against me with a sword and a spear and a javelin." I have no idea what Cargill is talking about. I think the better difficulty would be, it says that David didn't have a sword. Where did David get the sword? But even then, it says where he got the sword. Now, I don't like to talk about people and, insinuate that maybe they're lying. So I emailed Cargill to ask him, and I said, hey, I know with these documentaries, sometimes things get jumbled in the editing process. Can you please explain what you meant by that? I never heard back. So to this day, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, just like I wish he would give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. But this is one of those ones where you just read it and it takes care of itself. I would bet money that if you just read the passage every time someone gave you a Bible difficulty, the vast majority of the time, just by reading it, you would figure it out. I've actually heard stories of people that go through lists of these things, and like one after the other, they're just like, that's not what the text says. That's not what the text says. That's not what the text says. It's super simple.
If he had a sword and a javelin, javelins don't have a carrying pouch. So he'd have to have a javelin in his hand, he'd have a sword in his...
Yeah, there is some thought, too, that he had like a sword bearer. He had somebody with him to carry something. But yeah, you'd have to have it in its sheath if you were carrying a javelin. I'm not saying that he did have a sword bearer in that conflict. That's a perfectly valid point you bring up. It says that he took it from its sheath. And so if he had had the javelin and the shield, the sword would have been in its sheath. That's kind of what you're going for? Yeah.
Well, it just seems like some of these things are so flimsy, you know?
Nitpicky.
Yeah, it's just like, you're a PhD, and you're making a case with this kind of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, see, that's the thing with Bible difficulties. Sometimes, like in the resources, I'm going to include a book. It's like a 700-page book that you can download for free. I think it's legal. And it's all about hard sayings of the Bible. It's a really great resource, but the thing about it is sometimes you read along and it's like, who in the world would think that this was a difficulty? Like, it's so straightforward. And sometimes you're reading along, as we'll see later, and they don't even talk about it. And it's like, who in the right mind wouldn't talk about this? Like, this seems to be a major difficulty. And so, yeah, I've got some other examples of people with PhDs who just bring up the stupidest stuff, and they think that the Bible's hopelessly contradictory. So the second one, how did Goliath die? Cargill thinks this is a contradiction. Usually, if the supposed contradiction is two verses side by side, that should be a red flag right there, because these people weren't stupid, okay? So he doesn't like the fact that verse 50 says, David prevailed over the Philistine with just the sling and the stone. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. David did not have a sword in his hand. David ran, stood over the Philistine. He grabbed Goliath's sword, drew it from its sheath, killed him, cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they ran away. So how did Goliath die? The answer is he got hit in the head with a stone. Then, either to finish him off or just to make sure, David stabbed him with his own sword and then cut off his head. All of those things can be true. You think about it, you hear on the news, somebody gets shot. They rush to the hospital. They die from loss of blood. Is it a contradiction to say that they died from a gunshot wound when actually they died from a loss of blood? No, both of those things can be true at the same time. It's just recounting this battle. As a side note, some people think that the size of Goliath is a difficulty because the dude was 9 feet tall. That is pretty wild stuff, but that is actually only 6.5 inches taller than the tallest man that we have on record. His name was Robert Wadlow. He was 8 feet 11 inches tall. And there have been people, like that's actually a medical condition. Some people have said that Goliath might have suffered from something like that. I don't know. Now this one's the biggie, and this one actually took some digging. Was it David or Elhanan that killed him? In 2 Samuel 21:19, we read, And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jerry-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, if you look this up in the ESV, there's a footnote. The ESV actually does translate it as Goliath, not brother of Goliath. Most Bibles do translate it as brother of Goliath for reasons that you'll see. That actually goes back to what we talked about last week with the translation theories. Some people take the approach, you should be very close to the text and let the people figure it out for themselves. It's going to be a little bit harder to understand. Some people take the approach, you should do a little bit more interpretation for the people. It seems, especially in this area, the translators of the ESV, they translate what's there, but they give you this little indication, hey, something is amiss. So I'm going to give you this as kind of like a little case study. I don't remember exactly what the steps I took were to figure this out or how many sources I used. So this is something like how I figured this out. But I just got out my Bible study toolbox. And the first thing you should probably do is go to a source that only talks about Bible difficulties. This is that book that will be in the resource folder. Unfortunately, this book doesn't even talk about it. So that was a bust. But I knew that it was a textual issue, so I looked it up in the Net Bible. And if you remember from last week, the Net Bible is the most footnoted Bible of all time, especially when it comes to the text. And when you see a lengthy footnote like the one on the screen, you know that there's something there. So we'll read part of this together. The footnote for that verse says, the Hebrew text as it stands reads, Elhanan, son of that guy, the Benjamite, killed Goliath the Gittite. Who killed Goliath the Gittite? So what they're saying is, every text we have says that Elhanan killed Goliath in that passage. They go on to say, according to 1 Samuel 17, it was David who killed Goliath, but according to the Masoretic text of 2 Samuel 21, it was Elhanan who killed him. Many scholars believe that the two passages are hopelessly at variance with one another. Others have proposed various solutions to the difficulty, such as identifying David with Elhanan. Maybe he had two names. Or positing the existence of two Goliaths. Maybe there were two guys named Goliath. I don't think there's any reason to believe either one of those, because David, it's not told that David is ever called Elhanan. And also the qualifier for Goliath is that his staff was like a weaver's beam. I think that it would be strange to have two Goliaths with that kind of qualifier for their name. This is what happened. In all likelihood, the problem is a result of difficulties in textual transmission of the Samuel passage. It's my understanding that the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, those are the least attested books as far as the manuscripts go. Which, I mean, that's not like to say anything bad about them. There's always going to be something that's attested the most, the least. I know in Revelation, or in the New Testament, Revelation is the least attested of the New Testament books. It doesn't mean you can't trust it. But when you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, there's a lot of footnotes because of the textual transmission of that. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, reads, Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath. Now that's why I had you look at that scene again where it flipped. Because the reading brother of Goliath, that is not in question in the 1 Chronicles passage. So we have two accounts of the same story. And in the Chronicles one, it says that Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. In the 2 Samuel passage, it does say that Elhanan killed Goliath. So what do we do about these?
So you're saying they don't question that Elhanan killed two different Goliaths, or two different giants, Goliath and Lami?
Well, I'm saying that the 1 Chronicles passage is not in question as far as the brother of Goliath is concerned. But the brother of Goliath is in question in 2 Samuel, which is the one we're kind of talking about. I also looked up in the commentary that is in the Net Bible, and Thomas Constable from Dallas Theological Seminary, he says that Gob was evidently another name for Gezer. The reference in verse 19 to Elhanan killing Goliath the Gittite seems to contradict 1 Samuel 17. However, 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, says that Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath. Evidently, that is the correct reading. So what he's saying is, the text in 1 Chronicles is correct. The text in 2 Samuel is not correct. Everybody tracking with me so far?
What's that last sentence?
It's...
That's weird.
Yeah, that's something in another context.
Okay.
It just says sometimes David was able to slay his enemies personally, but other times he had to rely on others for help.
But he's not, that sentence isn't relating to...
To Elhanan killing Goliath, no.
Why did you stick it in there?
I think it would make sense if you read the whole
Okay.
commentary. Another great place is evidenceunseen.com. I would actually go here first if you ever find a Bible difficulty, because this guy is basically just taking from all these different books and compiling them in his own words in one place. And he says pretty much the same thing. Now, how do we understand this textual issue? On the screen, in English and in Hebrew, I have the phrase Goliath, on the top I have the phrase Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. At the bottom, the Hebrew and English texts say the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. I will get rid of the English. Can anybody see there is something different in the sentence.
Top one has a blue line under it.
On that,
Very
one
good.
that looks like an N on the end, there's a little dip.
Very good. Now,
On the top of it.
Hebrew reads from right to left, so these are the first words of the sentence. I'll blow it up for you. On the top, we have the direct object is going to be the next word, Goliath, the Gittite. On the bottom, we have the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. Notice, it's not even an entire letter. It's a single line, and on the one that we think is actually the wrong one, it's curved at the bottom. And on the one that we think is the right one, it's just straight. Now look at that. The parallel in 1 Chronicles specifically says it was Goliath's brother. When you look at the text, the only difference is the bottom of a line is either curved or straight. These are handwritten manuscripts. Here's the only flaw in my argument. If you remember last week, we talked about conjectural emendations. That's where you don't have something in the text to back it up, but you say, I think it should read this way. All the texts that we have for that 2 Samuel passage, they do say the brother of Goliath. But which is more believable? Do you think that the scribes during the hundreds of years of transmission miswrote a curvy line for a straight one? Or do you think there was confusion concerning one of the most well-known stories about one of the most well-known battles regarding the greatest king of Israel? Notice at the end of that clip, they kind of have this like conspiracy theory thing, like there's a cover-up. You can't just change history like that. You cannot tell me that these verses are hopelessly contradictory. Anybody have time for a few more? Okay. Look at rule number 9 on your handout. Remember that description is different from approval. There are a lot of things in the Bible that the Bible records, but the Bible doesn't necessarily prescribe. For example, in the Old Testament, people had multiple wives. I had a pastor one time, and he would just, every time we talk about multiple wives, he's just like, I don't know, I guess they were just allowed to do that back then. I actually don't think that that is what the Bible says, because when Jesus talks about marriage in Matthew, he says, for this reason, a man, singular, will leave his father, singular, and mother, singular, be united to his wife, singular, and the two will become one flesh. That is what marriage is. So anything that deviates from that is a problem. And when you look back at the Old Testament stories, having multiple wives usually caused problems, as you can imagine. Here's a really awesome verse that's fun to take out of context. When he got home, he took his knife, grabbed his concubine, and carved her up into 12 pieces. Then he sent the pieces throughout Israel. Now, the Bible describes that. And that's actually not the most disturbing thing in the whole story. You should look that up. The Bible describes that, but it doesn't say that that was a good thing. Okay? Earlier, we were talking about how sometimes these people that are so smart, they come up with the stupidest contradictions. I have a book on church history on my shelf that I got from the library for $1. This guy, I believe, has a PhD. And in this book, he talks about these hopeless contradictions in the Gospels. And his example is, Matthew's Gospel mentions wise men. The shepherds appear only in Luke. Mark doesn't even mention the birth of Christ. Contradiction. Now, when you introduce yourself to someone, do you say, hi, my name is, and I was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1983, and you start from the beginning, you tell every single thing? If not, you are living a lie. According to this guy, at least. But here's the problem, he says. In Luke 2, we see the shepherds. They find Jesus in the stable. But in Matthew 2, the Magi find him in a house. What's up with that? Now, you could say that houses probably had stables outside. When you look this up in the Bible, the Luke 2 passage says, today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born. So the shepherds hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. when you read Matthew 2, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of Herod the Great, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother. Now, child and baby are two different words. Notice, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave the orders to kill all boys in Bethlehem and in its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. So Jesus was probably around 2 years old when this happened. It's not a contradiction. The shepherds find him in the manger. This seems to be right when he was born. The Magi find him in a house. This seems to be around his second birthday. The Bible never says that the Magi and the shepherds ever met each other. Where do we get such an idea? Nativity scenes. It's just more convenient to have the wise men in the nativity scene. Again, one of my old pastors said, if you want your nativity scene to be historically accurate, you need to set it up and put the wise men in another room, because they're still on their way. Okay? I'll end with this. evidenceunseen.com. If you go up there to where it says Bible difficulties, you can choose Old Testament, New Testament. This is really nice because he can update this, he can add to it, and he's basically taken from all these really great sources. It's a really great resource. I say just go there, check it out for fun.